In this video, we're going to take a look at Montegrappa Blue. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. When I'm looking at this blue, in a lot of the writing, I see really good color variation from one pen to the other. It certainly gets darker as the pen gets wetter, and it does give very good shading. Now, there's this magical middle point that it is nice and it's darker and it gives really good shading. But then I was reminded, as I was looking at these writing samples on different papers, that I once had a subscriber point out that for students, an ordinary color with no real excitement about it could be a good thing for students because you don't necessarily want them becoming excited about whatever they're writing. You want them excited about the learning. Or so's the idea, but this is a good point that as a student, just a standard blue is really good. It could be an incredibly useful thing. Here is a really good standard blue that is well behaved, and that's just like the kids in my class. Well behaved. Now, this has a lot of shading. Not tons, but enough to keep it interesting. Like, I hope my class is interesting, but let's be fair, it's math. So they probably don't like it. I'm going to make them struggle through it anyway. Like you're going to struggle through this whole review. You skip, and I'm going to find you, and I'm going to make you do extra math problems. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Kaweco 475 with a vintage flex nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, we get no spread, we get pretty nice shading that's going on here. We get some really nice darker areas in this much lighter looking blue with this soft fine nib, which also happens to be a bit dry, bringing out its lightest tone in the writing. I like how this looks. I find it easy to read on the page. It's not too light. The medium, on the other hand, is much darker than the fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It still shades fairly well, but not nearly as much as you would have expected. So it does shade some, which will bother some of my viewers, and others not as much. If you look, you see on the third line the word not goes from darker to lighter to darker. Scrap goes darker to lighter to darker. So it does nice in bringing that shading. The broad nib is about the same tone as the medium. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has a little bit of shading, but barely noticeable at all, to be completely honest. Looking at the back of the page, you see we really have no ghosting and no bleeding. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib, a Pilot E95S with a medium nib, a Kaweco Sport with a broad nib, The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, light bits of shading that do show up. You see it when the word present is much darker than the word reader, but the E in reader gets much darker than the rest of the word. So it's definitely there. And being on cream paper, sometimes you see blues change a little bit. And this didn't. So this is a very opaque color and doing very well with that. The medium is much darker than the fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has a couple of moments of shading, just a light peppering of it throughout. Look at the N in even on the top of line. It's certainly darker than the rest of the word, but we're going from a dark to a much darker tone here. So I do think it looks good, though. The broad nib is the same tone as the medium with no feather, no spread, the same light peppering of shading throughout the writing. It's nice that it's there, but we are getting a good standard blue as a majority from the medium and the broad. Looking at the back of the page, we see minimal ghosting and we get no bleeding. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. The shading's pretty good. I think the shading is a little bit better than what we were getting on the Leuchtterm, although the tone overall looks a little bit lighter than we had on the Leuchtterm. The broad nib is a bit darker, quite a bit darker than we got with the fine. We get no feather, we get no spread. We do get some shading, not as much shading as we had at all compared to the Clairfontaine. It's in general, I think, a lighter tone than we had with the Leuchtterm itself. So here we are seeing it lighten up a bit on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it's about the same tone as the medium with no feather, no spread, only a few moments of light shading, nothing really standing out in any kind of great way. It's more there, and I do think this paper could use for a much wetter, finer pen to get its best look. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting. It's not bad at all here, and we get no bleed through.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it.
And here we see the results of the resistance test.
The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, we get no spread. We do get some shading going on here. Now, this is, I want to say, it's certainly lighter than the Clairfontaine, but it's probably about as dark as we got with the Leuchtterm or the Moleskine. It's just that it doesn't have that toned backdrop. I think it looks pretty good here, and I think it's very usable for a student, even in this lighter tone. The broad nib has no feather, has no spread. It's only slightly darker than the fine, but I think it's much easier to read. I think it's much easier to look at. And in this case, the thicker line is really helping it out quite a bit. The broad nib is about the same tone as the medium. It's not having any feathering. It's not having any spread. It's only got 1 or 2 moments of shading, nothing that would really be a big deal. I think what we're looking at here is not good for a student because it's looking faded. Now, perhaps a wetter pen than what I was using is going to help achieve that. I just can only ink so many pens. Looking at the back of the page, we see a minimal amount of ghosting doing very good, and we get no bleed through.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Califolio Azure. Here is Elixir Midnight Marine. Here is KWZ Azure number 3. Here is Noodler's Blue Eel. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. Very good performance. This paper, again, don't buy paper made in America. This should be cheap paper, and it's performing really well. We get some shading that's occurring. Look at how the is lighter on the top of the H than the bottom. Look at how study goes from darker to lighter to darker. It looks really good here. Now, the medium is much darker in general than the fine. I prefer how the fine looked to this. The medium does have some tiny feathers that are going on, but only in a couple of spots. Really very manageable. You'll see in the T and the N of hereafter some tiny little feathers. Not something that would stop you from using this paper. We don't have any spread. We've got a few spots of shading. Looking at the broad nib, we get no feather. Strange how that worked out. No spread. No shade. a lighter tone than the medium, and I do not like how this looks at all from this broad pen on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, you see minimal ghosting really for this paper, and we got no bleed through touching the page underneath.
While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a red ink by Birmingham Pen Company, their Fred Rogers Cardigan Red. Here is a pink ink by Noodler's, their Bay State Cape Cod Cranberry. Here is an orange ink by Pilot, their Mixable Orange. Here is a magenta ink by Sailor, their Kobe No. 6 Bordeaux. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the fine nib, we get feather, yes. We get spread, yes, but the spread is manageable. The feather is kind of gross. Now, I really want to think that's because of this being a soft fine, that as it's soft and bouncy while you write, it sometimes lets more ink through, and I believe that's causing a lot more of the feathering that we're seeing here, because anytime it gets darker, so yes, there is some shading spots, but it gets gross in its feathering. So yes, it does have some shading. Looking at the medium nib, it does have feathers all over it, tiny, constantly, blurry in certain places. Look at furthermore if you can make it out past the blur. It has spread, it doesn't shade, it's blue. The broad nib is about the same tone as the medium. It feathers, it spreads, it doesn't shade, it's just there. So hopefully it does good on the back of the page. Looking at the back of the page, we had nothing come through and touch the page underneath, which is great news for this ink in how it's doing, because it looked gross on the other side. We do get ghosting, but we would expect ghosting on this paper, so the way that it's happening, I think, is fairly good. You just have to deal with the blue vomit on the other side from the spread and feathering.
So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
Now, when I was thinking about pens, a medium flow fine or medium pen will really give some good darker tones with some shading, and I think it looks really good. I thought the drier fine was fine. It was perfectly good and very readable though, and I think I would be going with either that drier soft fine, because I kind of enjoyed the way that looked, even though it could be quite light, or I would be going after a much darker, much more solid tone with a very wet fine or a wet medium. And I think you would need the very wet or wet fine or medium to keep the shading out of the game, because I think this could look good without it. I use a lot of blues, even though it's not my favorite color, so some of them really pop with the shading and others not.
Thanks for watching.